Hi, welcome to Bake to the Future, the show where we examine what is happening in the baking industry with a future-focused lens. I'm Haley Blumenreich.
And I'm Katie Jewell.
Today, we are bringing you the latest information about the 2022 elections and how they might impact the baking industry.
And I feel like we just had a very similar conversation, but I realize now it was a few years ago. And so to help us understand this topic again, we have back on the show ABA's Lee Sanders, Senior Vice President of Government Relations and Public Affairs, and Jim Ellis, Senior Political Analyst at BIPAC, which is Business Industry Political Action Committee. Yes, lots of letters there. Jim, thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, these elections come around every couple of years. So yes, we have to do all of this all over again.
So what I like about this show is and you know, it's going to be a quick take, right? So we have our internal political experts who can help break it down for the baking industry specifically, and that is Lee. And then Jim, you're the big picture guy. And so I know even a week or two ago, last week, I was talking to people you think would really know what's going to be happening in this next election cycle. And they're like, I don't know what to expect. So Jim, why don't you tell us where we are right now and we'll go from there.
Well, I think the reason you heard some comments like that is because early on in the year, the Republicans were looking really good. The numbers were very much in their favor. Biden's numbers were low. The generic numbers favored the Republicans. And now it's evened out, as I knew it would. I always knew those numbers were inflated, and that as we got closer to the election, we would see kind of the ebb and flow of the election cycle lead to pretty much of an even race, which is what we have, and that's where the country is. I do expect a Republican uptick, however, as we go towards the election, because keep in mind now, and for some reason, and I have to admit I don't know what it exactly is, the Republican leadership hasn't done much to counter a lot of the offensive that the Democrats are using, particularly on the abortion issue, which they have obviously adopted a single issue strategy because they don't want to talk about the economy because the numbers don't favor them there. And the Republicans have failed to respond to that. The fact that we see basically even numbers still is actually a pretty good indicator for Republicans. And maybe the best indicator for them is the aggregate primary turnout. So we're down to just a few states voting, the very, very late states voting in the primaries. They won't change the national numbers too much because they're small states. And if you look at 35 states that we can compare, apples to apples, where they had statewide races in both 2018 and 2022 in the primary, the Republicans nationally are up 39% in turnout over 2018. The Democrats down 22%. And I think that's one of your better indicators because those are numbers of actual people voting and not a poll number, not from a sample of 1,000 people nationally. It's real votes of millions and millions of votes. So I think to me, in what I'm looking at for the election, I look to that as number one as to what we can see. Primary turnout has been a pretty good precursor in previous years to tell us what will happen in the general election because it measures enthusiasm. And particularly in a midterm or a lower turnout election, that is the determining factor. At least early on and through here the last couple of weeks, it's been the Republicans with the enthusiasm advantage.
And that's something I was going to ask you about, Jim, is this year is a midterm election, and maybe you could speak on how midterm elections might be different than the every 4 years presidential election that comes around, and maybe how that might impact some outcomes.
Yeah, and it all relates to turnout, and you'll always see midterm turnout being lower than presidential turnout. Now, we are in interesting times because we had the highest voter turnout of all time in 2020. And that beat the record that was set in 2016 by 22 million voters, which is a huge amount. And what we were seeing in 2018, the reason 2018 is significant is that was the highest midterm of all time. There were never 100 million votes nationally cast in a midterm election. And in 2018, we had over 110 million cast. So we're in a period of high voter turnout. And I would expect that to continue, although I think we saw a little bit more normalized numbers coming out in the 2022 primaries. So we'll see what happens. But I do think the Republicans still have an advantage in this election, particularly in the House. And so I would expect them to take the majority. Democrats have always had the advantage in the Senate because the map favors them. As you know, senators are only, they have 6-year terms, and so a third of the Senate comes up every 2 years. And in this particular class of senators that are facing the electorate in 2022, it favors the Democrats because the Republicans have to protect 21 of the 35 seats. So in other words, they already have 21 of 35. Democrats only have 14, but really of their 14, only 4, and now maybe 5 are vulnerable.
And Lee, you spend a lot of time talking to members, and I'm certain they try to bend your ear as to what's happening now in 2022, and we'll get to 2024 here in a minute. But what are some of the things, I want to make sure that while we have Jim here and while we have you here, what are some of the things that you're getting asked about the elections coming up? Or the primary elections that have already happened. So a lot of primaries kind of decide because, a region always goes one party or another. But what are some questions that you're getting asked?
Well, I mean, the big question is, are we going to turn over the House and the Senate? And so those are the big questions because that can mean so much for the agenda for next year. And so that could change the strategy and the priorities for our policy issues. So what is it going to mean for workforce issues? What is it going to mean for nutrition and labeling issues? And especially, climate is a big issue. We've got a farm bill coming up next year. And so it could change the direction depending on who's in charge. The other thing I learned is kind of interesting. I saw this morning that Republican leader McCarthy is going to come out with a statement or a strategy on September the 19th, so a week from now when we're taping this, to have a clear distinction or contrast between where Republicans are on key policy issues as opposed to Democrats. And so issues like immigration, crime, and economy are ones where I think we're going to hear more about from the candidates as we get closer to the election.
Yeah. So the big question then, if everybody's asking, are the House and or Senate going to flip to Republican? Jim, like what you're saying now is it maybe was a little bit more clear a few months ago, but it's a little bit more murky now?
Oh, yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, sure. And that was bound to happen, that these races were going to close. Remember, the Democrats have a big financial advantage. I think that's one reason that Republicans are holding back. Lee mentioned that McCarthy's going to come out with his contrast piece, his agenda on September 19th. My question is, why so late? That should have been out a while ago. And I think that's been the big difference, while it's helped the Democrats really gain some momentum that they may not should have had. I think the Republican response so far has been pretty poor of this election in terms of the leadership driving an agenda. Now, maybe that's going to change here on September 19th. But again, I think it's waiting a little bit too late. It takes a while to see these messages permeate, especially when we have early voting in most states. And we'll see, by the middle of October, almost the whole country will be voting or have the opportunity to do so. So now we have election month as compared to election day. And that changes the whole campaign cycle. It really does.
That's something I hadn't thought about, is that probably is a lasting impact from the pandemic. Are we seeing more of that at home or early voting?
Yeah, we've definitely seen trends in early voting go up. What we will see a little bit less of are the mail votes, because remember on the 2020, that was temporary sort of national edict from judges, and they can't change state law by doing that. So it reverts to the state law. So if you didn't have universal mail balloting before this election and your legislature didn't do anything to change that, then you go back to the way it used to be before 2020. So we will likely see less mail voting in terms of that. Not everybody will get a mail ballot like we got in 2020. And so we'll see what that does to the turnout.
And so, Lee, what are some, or Jim, either of you guys can kind of tackle this. What are some specific races or specific things that our members, our listeners might want to keep their eye on?
Well, certainly in the Senate races are big. There's really about, I think, 4 races on the Democrats are protecting, and several on the Republican side, at least 3 major open seats. So for the Democrats, they are protecting New Hampshire, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia. Those are the key ones. If Republicans are going to gain a majority, they have to win at least 1 and probably 2 of those states. Again, New Hampshire, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia. For the Democrats to gain, you look to the open seats, and the Republicans are down 6-1 on open seats, and really Vermont is the only Democrat seat that's open, which is a very safe seat for them. So you've got 6 open seats, 3 of which are highly competitive: North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And where Republicans have a problem is they have no margin for error there. They need to win all of those. And they have a particular problem, it looks like, in Pennsylvania, where Dr. Mehmet Oz, the Republican candidate, the television Dr. Oz, is 4, 5, 6, 7 points down in polling, depending on which one you look at. And, he's making an effort to try to make up some of that distance, but that may be a bridge too far. So we'll see what happens. And then Ohio, North Carolina are always tight. I think they will both break for the Republicans in the end, but things could change, definitely. The races are all close enough where some things happening between now and when people actually vote, whether it be the middle of October through November 8th of the election day, it could alter some outcomes. But I think those are the key states to watch.
And is it too early or too late to start talking 2024 presidential election? Do we feel like getting into that, or should we wait another few years?
It's probably not too early to even start talking about 2028, the way the presidential race is covered.
That's true. That is true. So what are some things there then? I mean, who's running? What's happening?
Well, we're going to see some action certainly right after the midterm. And a lot of people thought that former President Trump would announce his candidacy before the midterm. So far, he hasn't done that. And so we can expect that right off the bat. And then you got to look at what happens on the Democratic side. I mean, there's a lot of differing opinions as to whether Joe Biden will run again. I think most people think, and Lee, maybe you disagree, but I think most people think that he won't. You even have several Democrats calling for him not to run, like Tim Ryan, the U.S. Senate candidate in Ohio, has just this last week said he doesn't think Biden should run again. And what happens in that case? And if he does run, obviously he wins the nomination, but what if he doesn't, and who gets in on the Democratic side? And when does that happen? When does he announce that? I think the timing is going to be real interesting on the Democratic side. They're pretty much frozen until Biden says what he is or is not going to do. So far he has said he's going to run. So I think right now we should take him at his word.
The polling doesn't look so good for him, does it, Jim?
No, and it doesn't look too good for Kamala Harris either. So what do they do? So I think it's going to be an interesting few months right after the midterm election. And a lot depends on how they turn out. And if Republicans take the House, and if by some chance they take the Senate, you're going to see a lot of action happening on the Democratic side. Now, if the Democrats hold the Senate, Republicans take the House, which I think is the likely outcome, then I think things are up in the air on both sides. And we'll just have to see how things play out. But it's going to be an interesting few months right after the midterm. We're not going to get any break.
No, there won't be.
In this electioneering.
Well, gosh, thank you so much, Jim, for your insight. And Lee, we also do have some resources for our members to help them understand and follow the elections.
Oh, yeah. Our Rise to Action site is terrific. So there you can go and look up information on your senators and your representatives. You can look at key votes, key issues, and priorities for the industry and how members have voted on those things. So it's a great resource.
Well, awesome. Thank you both for joining us on the podcast. It's been very informative, and we always appreciate your insights, Jim and Lee, on these complicated topics and how they relate back to the industry. And I want to let our listeners know that they can let us know what they think of the show, of they thought of this episode, by emailing hello@americanbakers.org or leave us a voicemail at baketothefuture.org. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Music, or Ghana.